Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined today on a, slightly kind of mercifully rainy, but not quite rainy, cooled off day in Austin, Texas.
I think one of the things that makes us like legit Texas-based podcasters is that we almost always have to start up and be like, how hot is it?
Yeah.
It's like, it's not. It's only like 80 degrees out.
Even though I like every summer I vow, this is the summer I'm not going to talk about the heat.
No, but you're not. You're not because
I know,
it's
I'm talking about it being nice.
Because it's so nice out right now, by which I mean like rainy and like cold.
Yeah.
Cold, I put that in quotes. Cold.
It's very pleasant out there.
Very pleasant.
At least so far. So in the last pod, we did a long summary of the legislation and the legislative with a legislative session with a focus on legislation,
right,
with the hope of kind of winding up with some kind of a more interpretive discussion. We really got through, the long laundry list and had been at it a while, so we cut it off a bit with not too much interpretation.
There was some interpretation.
There was some. Well, part of it was that there was a lot of interpretation as we went.
Yeah, not the interpretation we intended.
Right, just not in the structure we intended. But hey, for the podcast, we were talking about remixes of Grateful Dead instrumental jams. So, hey, we're in the spirit of the thing.
This is like jazz in a rock vernacular.
And we are talking about maybe doing some of this. But, there's also a lot going on. So we'll see how this goes again. So we'll probably we're going to come around to this, and I think we've got some ideas about how all the pieces are a little bit connected here in some ways. But there's a lot of things going on as we're, typically this is where we're sitting around, the budget's been certified, and there's a bunch of bills on the governor's desk, and there's some stuff that that we'll get to that we're just really speculating about,
right,
what he's going to do with them. None more than the marijuana bill or the cannabis hemp bill that we talked about a lot last week, so I won't open that up too much. I won't open that baggie too much, but that is kind of the thing that I'm finding people paying the most attention to, and then there's, the obvious level of how is the governor going to wield the line item veto and what will the basis for those decisions be, et cetera. But I think we have to touch on some of the other news that has come up and has been percolating here in the last week since we were last here.
Right.
So we got to start, I think, on the Trump pressure for a special session on redistricting, because even though this is kind of macro political in some ways, it's also, clearly, obviously plugs into the legislature, because if they're going to do redistricting and they're going to redraw the congressional maps, which is what by multiple reports the president and his folks are pressuring Texas to do. Governor Abbott has to call a special session for that. Legislature has to come back. Right. And there were rumors about this were already kind of percolating. I think they were less, when I was hearing them in the last few weeks of the session, they were less directly tied to the White House wants this. Right. Now it's very much the White House wants this. Yeah. There have been meetings of the Texas congressional delegation in D.C. I believe as we record this on Thursday morning, there's another one scheduled for today.
Right.
So, there's a lot going on here, and it's an interesting case, touches on things that are not unfamiliar in the history of redistricting in terms of the legality in Texas of doing mid-decade redistricting, things like this. Not like redistricting fights are new to Texas, but it is. I was thinking about this as I was kind of jumping back into this and looking at the maps, that even though those maps are still in court in El Paso,
right,
and the lawsuits have been filed, it was a pretty quiet redistricting cycle. We talked about it a lot at the time, and it's kind of coming up again in some of the coverage. I think it came up in the New York Times story. David Goodman and one of his colleagues, and I can't remember who it was, somebody, one of the D.C. reporters, and I apologize to my friends at the New York Times, but broke the story. And there was a good background graph in there that said, look, they did this in 2021, and essentially it was an incumbent protection plan that didn't stretch the boundaries. So now there's interest in stretching the boundaries from the Trump administration in order to protect their very, very narrow majority in the House going into a session or going into an election in which the historically based pattern tells us should be a decent election cycle for Democrats with a Republican in the White House. Now, the more I think about that, I mean, on one hand, I think so. On the other hand, I don't know. But anyway, what are you making of this? What's your kind of, talk a little about where you're seeing kind of the pressure points in the maps.
Yeah.
We were talking about it before. I think we both have overlapping ideas about this.
Yeah. Well, just to go back a bit, I mean, you kind of opened with something that I think is sort of important. Just, I mean, I think most people who listen to this are pretty sophisticated people, but I think it is important just to kind of lay out here. You've got the president is asking, what would need to happen is you need for the governor to call a special session, right? And he's going to have to do it soon. That's the other thing, because in Texas, you file for office in December. So ultimately, for these maps to get done, voted on, get through whatever initial court challenges and all that kind of stuff to be sort of the maps that would apply for that election, most people think they're going to have to start by July.
I was just going to say, the reporting's been saying July.
But the issue here is, again, and this is sort of this is sort of the interest, the challenges and sort of overlapping, areas of power and interests, right? I mean, so Abbott needs to call them back for a special session when they just finished, and by all accounts, he's pretty happy with the output.
Yeah, he was quoted,
just declared it,
in the last 24 hours saying it's the best session he's ever had.
That's what I saw, so that's what I was kind of referencing in my mind when I said it.
Too, yeah.
So he's pretty happy with what they just did. They got out, relatively unscathed. When I say I mean the Republicans were able to kind of do a lot of what they wanted to do. Again, there's a couple things that are sort of hanging out there that we're kind of waiting to see, but it certainly doesn't look like the last few sessions. Now, I think if anybody knows, redistricting can be a little bit of a grind, right? And especially sort of, voluntary redistricting. And so you've got to have the governor call the House and Senate back. Again, this is not to redistrict the Congress.
Yeah.
So again, you've got Congress people who've got their own sets of interests, and they don't actually necessarily directly plan the process. Now, look, they're having conversations. Everybody's involved in the process, but they're not the ones making the maps and voting on those maps. And in fact, it's actually the legislators who are going to be doing that.
Yeah.
If that happens. And this all goes back to this other point, which is, the point of making the maps in a lot of ways, I mean, and this is sort of the political science observation, is to protect incumbents, is to make the seats safe. What the Republicans really
that's the chief motivation.
That's the chief motivation
under the circumstances we're in.
Right. Yeah. And so what you get is you got maps that they produced in the last round of redistricting, the goal of which was to create stability, and stability is in stable majorities, right? Republicans have stable majorities. And if you think about it, I mean, one of the things that's kind of interesting, and I do wonder about, again, you laid out there's some short-term, so kind of going into the specifics here, there's some short-term things that you got to look at, right? One, it's like, okay, it's a midterm election with a Republican president in the White House, in particular, a Republican president who's a big counter-mobilizer. So one, there's sort of this question of how much could you move, how much could you really do here is a first question, right? The other piece of this is when the maps they made, I mean, you can say it was sort of, it was semi-uncontroversial for Texas standards, but as a reminder here, one of the things they did with those maps was they were able to, despite the fact that 95% of the state's growth was due to the growth in non-white populations, they were actually able to increase the number of districts with majority white populations in it.
Right.
So this is all to say, there may be some room to stretch out that majority. The question is, it's probably not much. Now, that doesn't change the fact that if you're thinking about it, that's probably the case everywhere. And what Texas has that a lot of places don't is it has a lot of seats.
Right. And look, this was the other, this is a practical kind of response to the overly, one could, step outside our conversation and say, well, that's a really kind of reductionist and overly political by saying, that was just all about protecting incumbents. Clearly, we're all adults. It was. But, and I have people say this, there really, wasn't that much more room, to to get aggressive without inducing risk to some of these incumbents.
And that speaks to
that's where the pushback is coming from.
And that speaks to your, like, what are the seats we're looking at? And you start to think, and I guess it's like, look, I mean, just to be fair, I'll be honest, like, I haven't done a deep dive into this. The session just ended. We've got a post-session poll that we're collecting data on. We, are working on a lot of things. So I haven't necessarily gone and been like, let's start cutting through all this data. But there's some seats that obviously come to mind to anyone who, like, kind of looks at this stuff. And most of it's going to take place in South Texas. We're thinking about CD 28, Henry Cuellar's seat. We think about CD 34, Vicente Gonzalez's seat. And we think about CD 15, which is sort of in between those two sandwiches, which is the Monica de la Cruz district.
But they're protecting that one, right?
Well, so, but this is the interesting thing. If you think about the history again, if those are the seats where you think, well, those are the guys who are probably the most, and again, I'm going to put in quotes probably, because I think that's even debatable here, the most at risk. Now, they're at risk based on the election, in terms of the election numbers. The demographics of those districts and the nature of everything that's gone on, I think, remains to be seen.
Well, but those are close districts. I mean, look, to that point, I mean, the Cuellar district is, was a close, and, Henry Cuellar has got his own kind of problems in that district.
Right.
Vicente Gonzalez, also a pretty close district. Not as close as the Cuellar district, actually, in terms of, depending on how you want to index this. But the vote, those are the obvious candidates.
Well, but the thing is that, they drew those districts, in a lot of ways, and when Republican map makers looked at those districts, they created CD 15 to generate a Republican district, and they succeeded. But if you recall in that election, they were trying to win all three of those seats.
Yeah.
They built those seats to make them weaker Democratic seats. They carved out a Republican seat they could win, and they really pushed to try to win those seats, and they were unable to in an election in which Donald Trump was at the top of the ticket and won in an election that favored Republicans. Whether there's a bunch of votes that they can then pump into those districts without either, I'll drop this off to you in a second, whether they can actually, move votes in those seats without creating downstream consequences that make Republicans significantly less safe is really, an open question here. And I think
look, I think, you kind of touched on this, and the degree to which whenever you're doing redistricting, you're really cutting directly into the members' self-interest.
Right.
And so what Trump is asking is for people, and again, this is where redistricting that is, very tricky, and we're not, I don't run the software. We're not experts at this per se, we're not. I shouldn't even say per se. We're not experts at this. Just because we know more than the average person who's not interested in it at all does not make us experts.
Right, there are people who just do this software.
But the issue here is, in a very mechanical kind of way, it's great for Donald Trump to say we want to really build our Republican majority, protect what we have, expand it, go get them, Texans, you're our red state allies. But, you're asking a bunch of guys to go, so you want my district to possibly be less secure because you're moving the line starting a couple districts over in an election where I'm already looking at possibly, something of a, cyclical disadvantage.
Yeah.
Shall we call it?
That's a good way to put it.
And so, you look at what is going on out there, and then other things are going to enter in this. The personal element of this, I mean, this is Donald Trump. This is not, an ad hominem attack. It is an observation about the fact that he takes politics very personally. He holds grudges. He's sensitive to criticism. And if you start looking at, once you start moving these districts that is, I think you describe, are organized in these kind of strips that run from the border and get pretty far north. Right. So you've got these districts that start getting you, out of, at least to the edge of South Texas, and they're adjacent to districts where there are interesting things going on. And I think a couple of the districts that haven't been, even the Cuellar district, CD 28, the north end bumps into Chip Roy in CD 21 and 37, Doggett, and, which is right next door to 38 in Doggett, and then the Kassar district in 35. And there's no way they're not going to look at these maps as they have in every redistricting session since I've been here for sure, and going back even further, and look at the central Texas districts in the way that are adjacent to the South Texas districts and try to start moving stuff around. To poke at Kassar, to poke at Doggett. And then the Chip Roy thing, as we were observing, Chip Roy's not had the best relationship in recent weeks with Donald Trump over the budget. And, Chip Roy is somebody whose district I would guess would see some lines move in this, regardless of that, if they're going to start. It's the problem of all the second and even third order effects as you start trying to re-equalize the district because you're moving Republicans out of, broadly speaking, out of safe Republican districts into Democratic districts to make them more competitive.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, into the west of Cuellar's district is 32, which is historically the, sort of swing district in the state until it sort of moved in the Republican district. You can take Republican voters out of that district. 23, sorry, yeah.
Right, yeah.
Flipped it. You can take Republicans out of that district? No. And so that's sort of the problem. The other thing is if you think about, this kind of goes back to this piece about sort of, the incumbent protection thing. There's sort of two pieces here and they actually come out because there's a way in which what I said was wrong and it's useful here, but there's also the way that it's right, which is also useful here. The way that it's wrong is thinking about those 3 South Texas congressional districts. Those were drawn to be the least safe for those Democrats as possible when they drew them with the best data they had.
Right.
So first of all, they already tried to get those districts, just to be clear, in a way that protects the rest of the incumbents. The other thing is when you talk about the Doggett district, you talk about the Khazar district, but especially the Doggett district, that was such a massive change from the previous cycle when you look at that district, where that was, at a certain point, there were 6 different congressmen who all had a finger in Austin, maybe a finger of their district.
Right. Well, and Doggett,
and
Doggett
was running down to San Antonio. Yeah, Doggett's been moved around, but
every cycle.
But ultimately, they took that seat and they just put this basically a square over Austin and said, just take them. Just take the Democratic voters there. So look, you could chip into. You could move some of the Doggett seat around, but you know what? In most of Doggett's district, it's probably 70 to 80% Democratic. There's not a lot to do with that. It said unless you're going to put them in Roy's district because you're moving Republicans,
and then move some. But these are the kind of things that.
But this is the thing when you start to say so wait, who would this really screw? Oh. Yeah. But ultimately, when you start to ask those questions, if you think about it this way, if we're sitting here kind of, jokingly asking these questions, I guarantee you, Chip Roy's office is asking these questions. Michael McCall's office is asking these questions. Everybody involved is asking these questions. And we haven't mentioned
McCall. And McCall was, I think, in at least some of the accounts I read, one of the organizers of the first meeting in response to this. And, the McCall district is part of that whole dynamic of what you do with Central Texas and what you do with Travis County and all the Democrats that are there and all this.
And McCall district goes from kind of the outskirts of the eastern part of Austin all the way to West Houston, Harris County.
I think now it's even it's even more on the outskirts because they also it swings up through Bryan.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but the point holds. That McCall district is a pretty if you're talking about communities of interest and not that, it's a quaint concept now, sort of, that's not, that's not really going on in the McCall district.
Just one other thing just to say about this, because we could say a bunch of other things about this, but just about the challenge as someone who, again, we're not redistricting experts, but we do look at this data a lot, is that the Democratic vote tends to be a lot more concentrated geographically, and the Republican vote is much more spread out, which means it's not as simple as saying, well, what if we move these, again, if you've played around in redistricting at all, it's not as simple as saying, well, if we just move, a couple precincts from here to there, then all of a sudden it's like, no. Actually, because there's just not enough people. Or if there are a lot of people, then it's not a straight shot, right? Like if you're going to the edge of a Democratic district, let's say, and trying to make it less Democratic by moving in from that very edge, whoever's out there, it's going to be a mix. Say moving 3,000 new voters, and you say, well, 1,600 of them are Republicans.
Yeah.
So you get, so it's kind of like, it's not.
I'd be interested in knowing, who in the Trump administration is kind of the point person on this.
A lot of things, you sort of, I like a lot, I'll say I wonder, I'm not going to put this on anybody else. I wonder how much of this is like a request because, they want the outcome and how much of it has been like actually looked into for feasibility. Like, is this to your point, is there someone in there crunching the numbers, playing with the GIS data, figuring out
the reports I was reading, and again, who knows, like, wherever, you're getting the sense of the people who we've been kind of hinting at who we think is kind of, not even hinting, implying, suggesting who's kind of most at risk here. Yeah. There are also people out there doing calculation like that are in a Republican district in East Texas surrounded by other Republican districts going, Donald Trump wants this, sure.
Well, I think that's.
I'll organize the meeting.
I think that's a really important point. Like, I mean, there's sort of two pieces to this that I'm trying to be, balance fairly. And one is to say there's nothing more political than the drawing of the lines, especially when the drawing of lines is being done by the people who are going to run in those districts, right? So just in and of itself, this is one of the most political things you can ever undertake, and that's why. I think it's sort of easy to fall on the side of like, would they really do this? Knowing what we know. At the same time, to your point, I think it's very easy to see a safe Republican elected official saying, look, if Democrats get a majority in the House in the midterm, Trump's term is over.
Yeah.
He's not going to accomplish anything through the legislature. They're going to be, doing investigations. It's going to be a disaster. If we want to deliver on what we said we were going to 2 years ago, this is the only way that we can do that. So this is what we have to do. Now,
buttressed by, to go back to the kind of, focus on self-interest that, has been a sub-theme here. And then in addition, there are people going, and even if that doesn't happen, if I help do what the undisputed and very active head of the Republican Party wants me to do right now, there could be rewards for me. People have gotten great rewards in terms of appointments and
insider trading,
for doing relatively little for Donald Trump, right? I mean, you make a positive impression, and the next thing you know, you've got a pretty good gig.
This is something we're going to come back to again and again. But I do wonder, like, at what point, the actual electoral incentives of all of this kind of come to fore. Because your point is right. Like right now, I think, you want to help Donald Trump, you want to help him with the agenda. But I mean, to my point, I just say like, I think this could help Republicans here pick seats. It also might not.
Right.
It also might make them less safe in the short run or in the medium run. I mean, one of the things about, the sort of, you've been following, Texas politics for a long time. I mean, one of the things that contributed to Democrats' competitiveness at the end of the last decade, in other words, at the end of the last redistricting cycle, was because Republicans had reached, because they had to reach. They had a huge majority after the Tea Party waves.
Overreach meant erosion.
Right. Well, it just
meant natural erosion that happens with maps, which we've talked about.
Yeah, because you just can't have as big of a percentage if you're going to spread it out. And
maps have a natural kind of decay rate.
Right.
And so it's uneven and whatever.
And so that happened, and then they redistricted and they made safe seats, and it's pretty safe majority, unless you want to do this again. And the idea of doing it again in an election in which, you're probably going to face a tough environment, maybe not. And again, the politics have to play out. We'll see what happens. But just thinking again, the cyclical nature, the history, Republican, the White House, midterm elections. And you kind of wonder, okay, you're going to do this. And I will say this too, just for the historical perspective, because one of the things I'd say is, when you look at the mid-decade redistricting in Texas in the 2000s, I mean, one of the things about that strikes me, and I was a lot younger then, so you can, but it seems
we had this discussion the other day.
It seems to me, at least on its face, though, there was some broadly justifiable rationale along representation lines that the districts were not a reflection of the electorate. No Republican went statewide for a number of years at that point, and yet the congressional delegation was still
not that long at that point.
Well, it's still been a decade, but it was majority Democratic in the Congress at that point still, right? When they redistricted.
Yes,
even
that's
though,
the key point of that.
But I mean, again, for your average voter, you'd say, hey, look, Republicans keep winning statewide, and yet this isn't right? And I think as a sniff test, sure. It's still about political power. It's still about maximizing your seats. I don't know if this isn't a little bit different in terms of the whole, when people start saying about, elected officials choosing their voters, and it's like, hey, we're going to redistrict again. It's like, why? Because Donald Trump told us to.
Yeah.
Look, maybe that's fine. I guess maybe we'll see. I don't know.
Not to, there's an erosion of norms piece of this, but that is about redistricting, about leadership, et cetera. But so we'll keep an eye on that. The other thing that we haven't mentioned that we should at least flag, and we'll put a pin in this, puts Greg Abbott in a very interesting position.
It does.
The negotiation with Trump over this, how Abbott manages this, the governor manages this, is going to be very interesting to see.
Yeah, and I also think
he's managing, as he's managing some other
things.
Where's
Burroughs and Patrick on this now, too?
Right.
Which I haven't heard a lot from them.
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as they're not messing with their chambers, they certainly, just in practical terms, I'm sure nobody wants to do it.
Right. Let's just be. We should end this
in the legislature. Nobody in the legislature is going, this is going to be great.
Yeah.
And though some people will say that they're more than happy to do it to serve their fearless leader.
Yeah.
I won't speculate, and I haven't been on X or Twitter. So, but there will be some people that will take that position, even though in their heart of hearts, they probably don't really want to come back. All right. So let's move on. Next big story we want to put on it's on the radar. The ending of in-state tuition at public universities for undocumented immigrants in Texas. So this goes back to a law that was passed and signed by Rick Perry in the early 2000s. Trump administration the federal government filed a lawsuit to end it. I think something like 6 hours later.
I think the whole thing took 6 hours to kind of sort.
The attorney general announced that he had settled with the federal government and it was over.
Yep.
And, with the kind of, and Greg Abbott signed off on this,
that's how
not like we need another stark illustration of the difference between Texas politics in 2003, 2004, 2005, and Texas politics in 2025, but we have it here anyway.
Right.
So we had polling data on this. We haven't asked about it in a while.
Yeah.
But, we asked, shortly, we wouldn't start polling until 2008, but we asked pretty early. We had data from like 2008 or 9 on this.
This was,
but we last asked in 2017,
in 2017, and I think that's one of those things, this is, we haven't been talking about this for a while, but for a long time, this was like a kind of a persistent issue kind of in the space in Texas politics, or, it was sort of a position, it was sort of, I would say, maybe an early insurgent Republican position. Say we shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah.
And I think, if you remember, Rick Perry famously basically defended this, and it was kind of the end of his presidential campaign in 2016. When he said, if you don't have a heart, basically.
It's our favorite, one of our go-to snippets here, but it's been
around.
If you really watch these things, even though Rick Perry's forgetting the third agency, whatever.
That was the thing.
That whole thing. This actually happened about a week, I think, before that debate at another town hall or something during the 2012 Republican primary. And it was really then that Perry was taking a turn as a poll leader. Like he had gone to the top of the poll as Republicans were cycling through candidates that year and kind of going, well, how about this guy?
Right.
And they'd lead in the polls for a while and
Yeah.
And that was kind of the beginning of the end. Perry defending this policy and expressing more broadly empathy for dreamers was the beginning of the end. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't bring it up because the history is not necessarily important. I just sort of saying it's amazing given the centrality that this policy had and sort of to, kind of aspects of the political debate around immigration, around, sort of the rights of undocumented people in Texas, that in 6 hours it just evaporates.
Yeah, and
right, with nobody really even batting an eyelash. And I'll say this. People are batting eyelashes for other reasons. Right. And just to go back to the polling, last time we asked about it was in February 2017. The plurality of Texans, 47%, said that these undocumented students should get in-state tuition. 38% said out-of-state. 67% of Democrats said it should be in-state tuition. 12% said out-of-state. Among Republicans, 57% said that they should pay out-of-state tuition. 30% said in-state tuition. So it's one of those things, not, less, kind of the thing we found a lot, you start talking about younger people, kids, you say, hey, these are the ones who didn't break the law. They did what you're supposed to do. So
put a pin in that because we'll come back to it when we talk about the protests.
Right.
But the other point I would make about that, which sort of we were headed towards, and then we went to the polling data is, this is, there's now been a countersuit or a suit filed.
Right.
And there's, and again, don't do redistricting, not a lawyer or a litigator. Right. But there does seem to be some legal questions about this kind of collusion, the appearance of collusion in this lawsuit that is not, it was like, it's kabuki, it's a legal kabuki theater is kind of the argument that you can't file a lawsuit and then have the person who's supposed to be defending the lawsuit for the state, the attorney general in this case, collude with the person suing to basically achieve their objective rather than some real defense of the state.
And this may sound a little weird.
There's a lot of, subjectivities, and that's why, not a lawyer.
Yeah, the only subject, there's a ton of subjectivities.
There's a Steve Loddick piece on this that I've got in my inbox, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, I'll just point to one thing, I think, that it kind of makes the point here. think about the separation of powers. Essentially, the federal government is going to say, we don't like this law that Texas has had, that its legislature has passed, that its governor has signed, that has been the policy for a number of years. The attorney general of the state, again, not part of the legislative branch, agrees.
Yeah.
And then they use the judiciary. And that's the thing where the judiciary gets mad.
That's where the separation.
They use the judiciary to get to their end.
Right.
And generally, there's a lot of people, conservatives especially, who don't like using the courts to make law. And in some ways, you're not making law. We're not making law. We're getting rid of law. But it's like you're policy making.
The end term of art now, I believe, is lawfare.
Lawfare. Well, I don't. That's a whole other dimension of this. But the idea here is, again, because the collusive agreement led for these actors to use the judiciary to achieve their political ends, when generally the courts would say that's probably something the legislature should do. Right. I mean, like historically, because they're making the laws. Now, again, if the law is unconstitutional, if it's illegal, whatever, there's other things about this. But the point here is, again, the idea that the courts are being used to enact, again, something that probably should be done legislatively is the problem.
And what were those Republican numbers in 2017 again?
30 thought in-state tuition was better, 57 out-of-state tuition.
All right. So those numbers will move.
Yeah.
And I think we had a don't know was a third option or something. But we didn't have a... they shouldn't be here to begin with option in that question, I don't think.
No, it's just a reflection of the policy, right? But you're right.
Yeah, right.
You're right. You're right.
But as I think about what that might look like going forward.
No, I mean, there's a certain aspect of you're like, well, out-of-state tuition because they're not from the state of Texas and America.
Right.
And it kind of gets, for sure.
Right.
It gets a little complicated.
But nonetheless, I asked if those numbers again. And we talked about it a lot when we put that question together. I vaguely remember.
It's a wordy question, actually.
And it's just, there was that whole, like, what are we actually, how should we bound the universe of possibilities here based on what the question on the table is?
Right.
And the question at the table did not include, I think, in any meaningful way, just saying, no, not only we should go to the colleges and find these people and deport them, which is kind of the position we've evolved to, right?
Right.
So it's going to be, we're not going to be able to step in that stream again in terms of checking public opinion exactly. We won't get trend data, right?
No, not exactly. I mean, what's interesting is we will get trend data. I mean, we'll accept that the concept, the context has changed dramatically, but we have another question that we will probably ask if we're not already, that we've asked before about we have other questions. I don't want to get into the details. Right. We have other questions we can cross this with to get a little bit into some of the details here.
We can show you a little how the sausage is made, but you don't really have to see the byproducts scraped out of the animal. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sorry, that was a little ugly.
Aggressive.
I think our engineer's cringing a little. Apologies.
All right.
So, in a big way, immigration with a state twist back on with the real intervention from the Trump back on the agenda to the extent that it was ever off. So let's move on to the next thing and then tie it all together. So the other big story that we kind of want to air out here, or bring to bear on this discussion, there have been significant. Characterizing the size of these protests has already become kind of part of the discussion, but we'll come around to that. Protests broke out, I think, first, at least in terms of media coverage, in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. I think there were also some things in San Francisco about the same time, and also in New York. Mm-hmm. But the Los Angeles one seemed to have been earliest and biggest, in response to ICE immigration raids in the kind of central Los Angeles area. Trump administration response, clearly Trump administration saw this as a gift.
Yep.
Was to nationalize the California National Guard without any discussion with California authorities. Mm-hmm. I think there's general agreement on that. And then when there was pushback to that, and that seemed to feed the protests, to now have sent, several hundred U.S. Marines mobilized from the base side at 29 Palms and sent into L.A., which is a quick commute.
Is anything a quick commute in L.A.?
Well, go at the right time. Got to know when to go, man. I started noticing, watching kind of the cable coverage, of things happen in LA. It's kind of the Patria Chica, even though I've been gone a long time. All of a sudden, I was seeing split screens in Dallas. Mm-hmm. And then the next night in Austin.
Yep.
San Antonio kind of made the national cutaways last night. Didn't get a lot of attention, just a little bit. There's some things going on here. KXN reporter jogging around, trying to kind of reminds me of the Tony Paletzky being sort of on foot during the 2020 protests. All that said, so now Texas is kind of part of this story.
Yeah.
Governor Abbott, per recent reporting, is staging National Guard troops near planned protest spots. There's a big, loosely, I think, indivisibly organized national satellite protests all over the place, planned for several places in Texas.
Yeah, there's going to be a big
on
one
Saturday.
Yeah, right. Sort of counter to the military mobilization / Trump's birthday.
The celebration of the Army / Donald Trump's last birthday of his 70s.
Yep.
It's a big birthday. So now you've got yet another sort of facet of the immigration politics front and center. And these, for those, that still watch cable news, a dwindling number, I know. Mm-hmm. But this is, sort of dominating coverage. They're cutting, the big cable networks have people in L.A. They have them, they have them in L.A. and in New York. And then they've got, they're going to local affiliates to catch what's, wherever things are flaring up in other places. And I'm using flaring up in a very generic term. We should say, there's been some violence, some Molotov cocktails. Apparently, it's a bad time to be a driverless car.
Yeah.
They burned several Waymos and I kind of wondered if that wasn't a little bit of a splinter protest.
Yeah,
I mean, I could see people in Austin setting fire to some way. My neighborhood, they would gladly go out and set fire to Waymos.
Four of them went by me when I was walking over here.
Yeah, no, it's nuts.
It was
it's
wild.
Nuts. They're everywhere. And again, but we digress.
Yeah. I wouldn't throw a Molotov cocktail on one though.
No, well, you're pretty civilized. So we were talking about this before. So, we've got this alignment of politics. The national level, I think the gut level response, and I think there's something to that, is, this is like where Donald Trump lives.
Yeah.
Would he rather be talking about, ironically, whether he's, whether the taco trade is a good trade because Trump always chickens out?
Right.
Or would he rather be talking about lawlessness in the streets of Los Angeles, unburdened by, the facts? I mean, he's more than, the way the Trump administration is telling us the entire city of Los Angeles is besieged by anarchists and protesters throwing Molotov cocktails.
Right.
That's not the case. Because we were talking beforehand, not that the truth doesn't matter, but for the politics and the opening that the Trump administration is taking, they're not burdened by being particularly accurate about this. So it doesn't matter.
No, and the thing is, and this is something, we've seen this kind of play out before, and I think, it's interesting in the sense, on the one hand, you'd say, I think, if you're like the Democratic Party, you'd say, hey, all these sort of counter mobilizations, these counter protests are actually like a sign of the kind of energy that they so desperately need at a point when their, standing in the public is incredibly low. So on the one hand, you could say there's an opportunity here for Democrats noticing sort of this national mobilization against Trump. But it's not.
And it's not the border. It's something a little different.
Yeah, it's about and it's about sort of the enforcement. But again, the details. I guess the details don't exactly matter. And this is kind of where the challenge comes for Democrats, and why this really is in a lot of ways a gift for Trump. If you think about it, why are the protests being mobilized? It's being mobilized in a lot of ways because of the specific ways in which the Trump administration is, in some ways, forced to carry out its immigration policy if its goals are as big as they are, because ultimately you're going to have to start going to cities. You're going to go to hospitals. You're going to be going to these places where there are people. And ultimately, some people are getting pretty upset about that. Okay. Makes sense. But, the real, I think, challenge with all this is, and there's like a lot of things, and it's weird. I've had this comparison where I think about library books, What was the other example I used? I used library books and defund the police.
Yeah.
There's a situation where Democrats are kind of in a similar moment here, right? Where it doesn't really matter if 99% of the protesters are peaceful. One guy shows up with a Molotov cocktail and all of a sudden they're all thugs.
It's a riot.
They're all gangsters. It's a riot. The city's being taken over. And for Democrats, it's stuck in two places. Either you say like, well, no, that was only one guy or something like that. Or you say, well, no, most of them were peaceful. And it's like, in politics, like, what? Say these thugs are taking over the city. That's your one message. Or no, wait, it's really a lot more complicated. Hold on. Let me explain.
Right.
It's too late. And so the problem is it's like, a couple Democrats or a couple, let's say Democratic aligned, activists come out and say, we need to defund the police. And now every Democrat, well, do you want to defund the police? It's like, well, no, but I think we, and then you're kind of stuck. Same thing. we find the most lurid passage in a library book and say, well, do you think this should be in the libraries? And the Democrats say, well, let's talk about free speech. Too much.
Right.
And the same thing here. And it's sort of like any violence at all, it's very easy for Trump to basically paint that as the picture of any resistance, any Democrats, and the justification for him moving military into those places, mobilizing the guard. And to say that,
quote unquote law and order response, which he loves.
And to say that the Democrats have an easy response in this, I think is not. It's not clear to me what the response is for Democrats or how they thread the needle on a lot of
we
this.
were talking about this, and the problem is, there's not a Democratic response because one Democratic response is to be, come down wholly on the side of the right to protest.
Right.
To say,
some
version of, we can't judge all of these protesters by a few troublemakers, et cetera. And this is important.
Yeah.
And look at, this is exposing the degree to which Donald Trump is an authoritarian and a threat to democracy. And, and there have been a couple of, we were talking about a couple of different responses from the kind of more adjacent Democratic response that is trying to learn the lessons from these past situations you've talked about. Like you were talking about Mayor Kirk Watson of Boston.
And so, to the extent that, that Abbott has, staged the guard to be ready for unrest here in Austin, Watson said, okay, yeah, we know where they are. It's good. We got them in case there's unrest.
Yeah.
But, it's just protests. And I think, and then you can see that's someone, again, Watson is not a dummy. He's been around a while.
Right.
He lives in Texas. He understands the dynamics here. And that's probably, in a lot of ways, it sort of feels like a cop-out, but in a lot of ways, it's kind of the best response a lot of Democrats can have, because the idea is say, like, no, so do you want lawlessness?
But you know what he's getting for that?
Do you want riots?
He's getting for that. And again, the mayor has, there's already a kind of well-paved path for this. But, this is going to add to the, Kirk Watson is a dino. But this
is why Democrats don't take these approaches, right? To the extent that this is why when someone says, "Oh, so do you want to defund the police?" You saw it was such a moment of bravery when a Democrat would say, "No, of course I don't want to defund the police," which again, it sounds crazy. Same thing. It's like, no, of course that passage shouldn't be read by third grade. Like, but even saying those things is almost like you're going to create some opposition within your party. Like there's a cost to that, and so there's a cost to being that clear that you're against, whatever that thing is, because there are people in the party, there are activists on both sides who are not going to be, we're going to be turned off by that, right?
Right. So the other example that I would point to of how Democrats are trying to respond to the situation and to, and look, let's just call it what it is, Trump's advantage here.
Right.
I mean, you can like Donald Trump, you can not like whatever, but Donald Trump has added new dimensionality to the bully pulpit as a tool for a president. He's all broadcast all the time.
Yeah.
Whether it's social media, whether it's, his use of, dropping provocative quotes, coming back to the press plane, or just his public statements and his speeches. If you're trying to fight Donald Trump and he's using the power of the presidency in the way that he is, man, it's a hard fight.
Yeah.
Ask Elon Musk.
Right.
Right? I mean, here's a guy that had, sorry about the cliche, richest guy in the world, is having a spat with the president and, he apologized to the guy.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder how many times Elon Musk has apologized in his life. My bet that at least sincerely, and that list may still be zero. I don't know. But anyway, point being, the Democrats are just trying to, they've been on their heels since the election, really. And there's been this internal debate about, do we try to figure out our messaging, our new narrative? Do we take the fight back to him? Or the kind of more common position is like, let's let him fail in a way. I mean, it's inevitable that,
It's tricky.
But the other example is just a flag is the Gavin Newsom speech. So Gavin Newsom did about a 6 to 8 minute speech that he released on social media. Got a lot of attention, and again, Gavin Newsom is often, the negs on him is that, he's too opportunistic and his ambition is too naked, right?
Yeah. I'm just laughing because as someone who watches politics for a living, I'm like, okay.
Yeah, right. I mean, well, okay. So he should just be quiet?
Yeah, well, he should just be better at it. That's what that's what that criticism is. He can be a little better at it.
Please give me as an observer some plausible deniability.
Could you just cover yourself with a towel?
Right. At any rate, he did the 6-8 minute speech. Had had its moments, but it was very clearly, in addition to trying to rise to the moment and assert some leadership, and he's being talked about for 2028. Clearly,
clearly interested.
But it was an interesting, it was not unlike the Watson.
Yeah,
it was kind of like, hey, look, just want to be clear, no violence, no destruction of property. You will get arrested. You deserve to get arrested.
Right.
You want, if people are going to enforce immigration laws, and we're going to go after people that are criminals, that are actual criminals.
Yeah.
Kind of, we can talk about that too. But this is, and then he kind of, so in terms of, there's this pragmatic part for the pragmatic argument and the reality of his position vis-a-vis the president. I need to do that. Yeah, fine, come arrest me. But also, he did hit and look, make no bones about it. This is what threats to democracy look like.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is that we got a boy called Wolf problem here a little bit, right?
Yes.
Because I don't necessarily disagree that when you're deploying Marines in this kind of ambiguous, not invited.
Look, let's just look. I'm like, I like to keep it at a certain level, but look, the idea that free speech rights mean something in America when, if a planned peaceful protest is organized, the government is going to then automatically, if they disagree with your point of view, send the military to observe you, to watch you, to stand there.
Yeah.
That ultimately is an attempt to impact free speech rights.
I think the term I'm looking for is chilling.
Well, that would be the term that people would use. Like, the intention is to chill the free speech, right? Like, I mean, I don't think there's just,
and it's a clear, look, Donald Trump operates this way. It's one of his most effective tools.
Right.
He's an intimidator.
Yeah. No,
right?
I hate to say
this attachment to the military.
The best thing that could happen to Donald Trump in this whole thing is if those Molotov cocktails get thrown towards the military. Right. That just justifies everything that he's saying, that this is law and order, this is violence, this is out of hand, and therefore everything I'm doing is justified here.
And this is why you're having people like Kirk Watson, or obviously at a different level, Gavin Newsom, kind of saying, hey, look, we don't want that to happen, and we want to urge everybody to not do that.
And that's the thing. I think that the challenge is for Democrats, you're right. Like, that is the message. The problem is it takes okay, well, let me set this all up.
Yeah.
I'm going to set
you have no control over it.
You have no control over it. Exactly. And so, yeah, it's going to be, I mean, I don't know. I think there's sort of a longer arc here, and it doesn't really matter. We're kind of getting towards the end of time. But I mean, I do think about sort of how, 4 years ago, there was a big concern among Republicans about, free speech rights being rescinded. Yeah. We asked a question in one of our polls during the Biden administration about, basically biggest threats to America, foreign threats, internal threats, AI, misinformation. One of them was sort of restrictions on free speech. That was one of the biggest things Republicans were concerned about at that point in time. There was this idea that, Democrats, universities, so on and so forth were essentially silencing the voices of conservatives, and therefore, we needed to essentially open up free speech rights because we were losing it. I'm just it doesn't really matter, and hypocrisy, whatever. Right. None of this matters, but it's sort of like, boy, that's a quick shift to now we're sending the military to observe the protests.
Yes, these principles can be sort of conditional.
Certainly can.
And I mean, look, I think the other specter that, is coming up here and there is January 6th.
Oh, yeah.
And the Trump administration response to that unambiguously violent protest.
Right. Yeah.
Which was to pardon the protesters. Many of them. So
yeah, we're in the thickets.
Wandering into.
Let me bring it back to something. You said something earlier about how he had opened up another dimension. But I actually thought you were going to go somewhere else. And I think what's interesting is that he's opened up another dimension in the immigration debate through this. And I think that's what's really interesting. So, with border crossings having basically slowed to a trickle to basically non-existent in the relative history of what we've seen recently, and again this sort of effort to turn immigration enforcement, again these mass deportation goals, inward, but the challenge of actually carrying it out. And the challenge isn't even there's just a logistical challenge, just in terms of manpower, right? But then also, of course, this is spread out, huge landmass, this country, and in some ways, it's going to be hard to do it. But what's actually happened now is because of these protests and because the idea that now there are groups of, describe the individuals however you want, organizing in cities to essentially, and again, can be described however you want, to promote lawlessness, to promote, against essentially that, there is no, again, we have no borders, we have no country, all this stuff. This is actually helps Trump because it manifests in a way that allows him to actually say, you know, I am still working on this immigration thing by deploying the Guard or by deploying the military to be at these protests, because this is now where the fight on immigration is taking place, which again, totally benefits him. And again, to the extent that we're, you know, where are we from where we started? I don't know, but like this is ultimately where we are right now. And it is an advantage to him. Now, you know,
well, look, I mean, you know, based on our data and discussions that we've had in here, I mean, I think you know, one of the questions is, and I think I know what the highest probability answer is anyway. You know, and I saw this, you know, what is going to be the movement in public opinion in that cross current space that we've talked in here a lot before, where if we ask people, do you think anybody in the, you know, essentially anybody in the country should be deported immediately? Anybody in the country illegally should be deported immediately, and we get these numbers, and you get these really high numbers of Republicans that say yes, like in the 80 percentile, right? 80% share. But then you ask, you know, as we did in, I guess, February, and we've talked about this, forgive us if you're a regular listener, but it's a different turn on this. You know, how about, you know, arresting people in schools, hospitals, and different locations, different conditions. And we saw a bit of variance in that, but pretty uniformly lower levels of support once you put people in a concrete frame / situation than we did for the general principle.
Right.
Well, now we're seeing as they execute the policy, and these protests clearly a fallout of that policy. Are we going to see movement in that or not?
Yeah, and it's tough because I mean,
I don't know.
And one of the things I
kind of think we will, but I don't know.
Well, and I think, you know, one of the things, and you know, talking about the sausage making, and this is useful, I think, is, you know, as public opinion researchers, experts, whatever, you know, you start to think about this and like, how would you ask about this? It's like, you know, what are you asking about? Are you asking about the right to peacefully protest? You know, sort of against.
Right.
Well, let me ask this. Let me actually go back a bit. Are you asking about the right to peacefully protest in general? Are you asking about the right to peacefully protest the Trump administration's deportation efforts? Because those are going to be two different things immediately. You get different responses to those. So you think, speaking to your point about the general principle versus the specific. And then you'd say, so you assume, you know, be a lot less Republican support for that, just all else equal.
How important do you think free speech rights are?
Yeah, and then you can go, so how important are free speech rights? You know, do you support people's rights to, you know, again, essentially, you know, protest the deportation efforts? Do you support people's uses of violence?
Right.
And the answer is going to be, and it's going to keep decreasing. And that's the thing here. And that's why you see Trump focusing on the violence. You'll see Democrats focusing on free speech. But where the immigration piece of this crosses it is a bit of a challenge here, because, you know, this kind of goes back to your point about the in-state tuition is actually a great way to kind of bring this back.
Yes.
It's like, hey, but what if they're already undocumented? Aren't they already breaking the law? Which is ultimately kind of the most reductionist way we can get around all this. But eventually it all leads back to that at a certain point.
You know, but then look, that is the default position. I mean, and I think that's what we're seeing. That's the default position.
Yeah.
And then it's like, how do you reconcile exceptions, you know, whatever you want to call.
Further circumstances.
Yeah, circumstantial.
Mitigating circumstances.
Yeah, right. Circumstantial diversions from that base position, right? And, you know, that is made even more complicated by, I think, this media environment, because as far as the issue of the protests, you are seeing, you know, depending on what kind of media you consume and where, this is looking very different.
Right.
Right. I mean, if you're watching the kind of CNN center left and local news, I mean, what you're seeing is most of that coverage, and I kind of had it on around the house a lot over the last few days, you know, is a correspondent kind of going, well, there's people here. So far, there's not a lot happening.
Yeah.
You can't really tell how many people are there.
Yeah.
You know, and then maybe the police move them, and then, you know, it's a correspondent going, oh, the police are making us move, maybe something, you know. But most of it is a kind of just like watching people mill around, and maybe you hear somebody chanting in the background.
Yeah.
You know, but on the center left media, you're going to wind up seeing everybody that got arrested and got wrestled to the ground and handcuffed. On the center right media, you're going to see those burning Waymos and, you know, whoever is like, you know, people resisting being arrested or appearing to not enjoy being arrested or cooperating. And how that all is going to like filter into this is going to be what we do know is that going into the session to close this out.
Yeah.
There were two issues that people said should be the legislature's top priority. One was immigration and border security. The other was economy and prices.
Right.
Much of the discussion in the last few weeks, particularly after Liberation Day and the announcement of the tariffs, has been focused and even focused on the degree to which people are worried about the economy, are worried about prices, et cetera.
Or the extent to which the market is basically not taking Trump seriously.
And
which I'm sure he
the taco
hates.
thing, right. All of that stuff, right? And that is not to Donald Trump's advantage right now. It's just not, right? And this has now shifted the discussion back in this direction. And as we saw all session, filtered down into Texas, where all of a sudden, you've got this discussion of the National Guard. Everybody's kind of wondering what's going to happen in these places across Texas this weekend.
Well, and I think even going back to the in-state tuition, and also this is the first sort of entry point into higher education in Texas in a really public way by the Trump administration. They've been mostly going for places like Harvard, universities in left-leaning states, but this is the first sort of really public effort by, again, the Trump administration to get it higher in Texas.
And they get a double hit on it because they poke at the university, but in a way that's not, not as fundamental as they are at these, the Harvards and, the Ivies that he's going at. But you're right. I mean, it is an interesting convergence. Convergence. That's the word I'm looking for. Convergence of that. And, there's not much resistance here that I've seen. I mean, there's the lawsuit's been filed, but, there's been a lot of that.
Yeah.
So, all right. With that, Josh, thanks for being here. Thanks to our folks here in the excellent production team here in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin in our snug little home in the Six Pack. Some of the data all the data we've referred to really will be at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. So most importantly, thanks y'all for listening. We will probably take a bye next week on the podcast. So you won't get a podcast next week, but we'll be back the following week. Probably, I'm hoping with some pretty interesting things to talk about. So with that, thanks again for listening, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.